Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Allison Rose Sokol. I'm the Vice President of P12 Policy, Practice, and Research here at the Education Trust. Thank you so much for joining us for this first session in our series on data for equity. This series is part of our work through the Alliance for Resource Equity, a partnership between the Education Trust and our amazing partners at Education Resource Strategies. And together we aim to provide tools and resources for providing all students with the resources they need to succeed. We're so glad to see so many state and national advocates and partners joining this important conversation about how data and transparency are crucial in the fight for educational equity. And we're really excited to provide you with new and updated data sources to aid in this work. We know that high-need school districts and schools continue to receive less school funding than they need to meet the needs of their students. In today's session, Equal is Not Good Enough in School Funding, my wonderful colleague, Ivy Morgan, will share the most up-to-date data on funding gaps between districts and states and share policy options to address those funding gaps. She will demo our new data tool that you can use to explore the inequities in school funding between districts in your state, differences in funding between schools in districts, and for the first time ever, school by school spending data for all schools in the country. I will come back at the end to share some more opportunities for us to learn together in the coming weeks. But I'm going to turn things over to Ivy to talk with you all today about funding inequities. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Allison. I see the participant number still ticking up, so I'm going to slow roll this for just a bit, but share my screen while folks join the session. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm glad to be here with you this afternoon. Like Allison said, I'm going to be talking about a report that we released, that the Ed Trust released in December, titled Equal is Not Good Enough, and then I'll talk a little bit about the accompanying tools. So on the agenda here, right, I'm going to review the analysis and findings. We'll have some time for me to walk through the data tool and for you all to explore the data tool from your computers. And then I will definitely leave time at the end for questions, but do feel free to put questions in the chat. My colleagues will be monitoring it and they'll flag things that, sort of like really need to be answered in the moment. So definitely ask them if you have them. Okay, so just like, I think we're all here because we know that school funding is important, but I want to do just like a little bit of context setting and sort of like background information. This report, Equal is Not Good Enough, is sort of an update to a series that we tend to call funding gaps that the Education Trust has been doing for like 20 years or so. This time around, our data tool includes new school by school spending data, and the report includes some context-specific policy recommendations and sort of actions that folks can take based on the specific findings in their states. And of course, we're doing this, right? We're talking about this because we know, right? There's sort of like no longer a debate in the field that money matters in education, and in particular, increases in spending do lead to improved academic achievement for students and a bunch of other sort of better outcomes. And there are greater benefits for students from low-income backgrounds. And I will say throughout this session, I'm going to be focused on state policy and state levers. And, I think that it's important to mention that because, state school funding formulas, sort of control upwards of 90% of all of the education dollars that exist in the system. State funding formulas should provide substantial additional resources to support the needs for students from low-income backgrounds and English learners. And states have the control to, sort of ameliorate the inequities that I'm going to share here. All right, so first I'm going to focus on the national and state-by-state findings, and then later on I'll get into the district level and school-by-school findings from our school-by-school spending data. In the sort of national and state level findings, we had two key questions as we were going through the analysis. One is, how do state and local revenues compare across districts in each state and across the country? One for districts with high and low percentages of students in poverty, two between districts with high and low percentages of students of color, and three between districts with high and low percentages of English learners. And then, like I said, right, our focus is on a lot of our focus is on state policy, because states have such a strong such strong levers in this space. So we throughout focus on the extent to which state revenue is making up for inequities in local revenue. Just a quick grounding in, sort of the data and analysis that we're using here. So the findings that I'm going to talk about right now are based on 3 years of state and local revenue data, and we do that to kind of smooth out any major fluctuations that there might be in specific revenue categories in a given year, such as capital expenses. This data is from 2018 to 2020. That is because that is the most recently available data. And so then the thing to keep in mind here is that generally the findings that we're talking about are sort of pre-pandemic findings. The analysis that we conducted is a quartile analysis. And so we are, really comparing groups of districts with the highest and the lowest percentages of students in the specific student group that we're talking about. And we have constructed those groups of districts so that each group represents about 25% of each state students. And then we're just, sort of doing straightforward comparisons of the revenue between those two groups. I should also flag here that we are excluding revenue from federal sources, right, because of our focus on sort of state policy and the things that states have the most control over. And that for this analysis in particular, the national findings that I'm going to cover right now, and then the state-by-state findings, exclude charter schools just because we just don't have good data on them from the federal data sources that we're using. Okay, so in a couple of slides, I'm going to display a set of maps, and those maps are going to be color-coded according to the rating scale that's on the slide here. The thing to highlight is that, the light blue color basically means that funding is about equal between the groups, meaning in our analysis that the highest need districts are receiving between 0 and 10% more than the lowest need districts. If there are any instances where the highest need districts are receiving less than lower need districts, then that is not good. That is not a good thing. And so those findings are sort of rated in that either that lighter red pink color or the darker red color. In this rating scale, you'll see that there's this dark green color on the left side. That means that the sort of differences that we found between high need and low need districts meant that the higher need districts were receiving at least 40% more state and local revenue. No state actually has that rating. That is not something that we saw in the data. Just going to pause for 2 seconds for questions here. Okay. All right, so finding number 1. is that across the country, districts with the most students of color receive substantially less state and local revenue than districts with the fewest students of color. It's about 16% less on average across all districts in the country, or $2,700 per student. And so the chart on the left here shows that on average across the country, the districts with the most students of color, that's Black, Latino, and Native students, receive about $13,830 in state and local revenue. And that's quite a bit less than the amount that the lowest, the districts with the fewest percentages of students of color receive. In the chart on the right side, the height of the bars is about the same. It represents the same number. But in this chart, we've broken out the differences in revenue by state versus local sources. And so what this shows us here is that the gap that we're seeing overall in differences in revenue between the districts with the most and fewest students of color is really driven by inequities in local revenue, right? The districts with the fewest students of color receive or raise on average $8,732 per student, compared to just over $6,000 per student in the districts with the most students of color. Generally, right, state revenue sort of across the board tries to make a state policy in the revenue that it allocates, tries to make up for differences in these kinds of inequities that we see in local revenue. And in this case, there's not a whole lot of differentiation in the amount of revenue that districts receive based on with different percentages of students from low-income backgrounds. So, the states not quite. The states are not quite doing enough here to make up for these inequities in local revenue that we're seeing. On a state-by-state basis, what that looks like is that in 22 states, districts with the most students of color are receiving less funding than districts with the fewest. Finding 2 is pretty similar to the first finding. Districts with the most English learners receive substantially less state and local revenue than districts with the fewest English learners. That is about $2,200 per student less. And we see a very similar pattern here. The inequities that exist are largely driven by inequities in local revenue. If you look at the chart on the right side of the graph, and state revenue doesn't do enough to make up for those inequities. In fact, right, state revenue in the districts with the fewest English learners is about $400 per student higher than state revenue in the districts with the most English learners. And here on a state-by-state basis, in more than half of states, 25 states, districts with the most English learners receive less funding than districts with the fewest. Next, we turn to our poverty analysis, where we're looking at districts with the highest and lowest percentages of students in poverty. And here too, we see that the districts with the most students in poverty receive less, about 5% or $800 per student in state and local revenue than the lowest poverty districts. Here, it's worth pointing out that the pattern that I've talked about so far is a little bit different. So right, the first thing to notice is that the gap that we're seeing that we've identified in the data between the highest and lowest need districts is quite a bit smaller than the other two gaps that I've talked about so far. Also, I think, we see a much more pronounced pattern where the districts with the fewest students in poverty are able to raise quite a bit more local revenue than districts with the most students in poverty. To counteract that, states are allocating quite a bit more state revenue to the districts with the most students in poverty than they are to districts with the fewest students in poverty. But still, that's not enough to make up for the inequities in local revenue that we see. And here on a state-by-state basis, that means that in 15 states, the highest poverty districts receive less state and local funding than the lowest poverty districts. I will pause here to address a couple of questions that I see in the Q&A. So first, the first question is how we decided on the 40% cut point. In our state advocacy, in our sort of advocacy around state school funding policies, we are focused on ensuring that state policies provide, allocate, prescribe substantially additional funding to meet the needs of students from low-income backgrounds and English learners, and to make sure that states are not providing less funding, at the very least, to meet the needs of students of color. There's no clear answer in the field about how much more is enough, but sort of the best, most rigorous research that we have available to date suggests that it is something in the 2 times as much range versus the 10% more or the 25% more range that we tend to see in state school funding formulas. And so when you take that 2 times as much more number and you sort of factor it into what that looks like on average across a district, recognizing that not all students are students from low-income backgrounds, we sort of estimate that what that looks like is something closer to 40% more than 10% more or 25% more, something like that. And so it's a back of the envelope calculation, but it is, I think, a helpful tool to kind of translate what that policy recommendation looks like for state funding policy to provide substantially more funding to meet the needs of English learners and students from low-income backgrounds. And this is a way to translate what that looks like on average across a district. And then the states in each of these maps, the states that are excluded for a few reasons. One is that, we just couldn't split the districts in the state into quartiles. That is true for Hawaii and Washington, D.C., even though it's not a state, and Nevada. And so that's sort of across the board. Those states are excluded from all of the analyses. And then in each of the analyses, there may be a few more states that are excluded, and those were excluded because there were fairly small percentages of students in the group that we're talking about. And so it just wasn't meaningful to do that analysis when we're to do the analysis in those states when it's just such a small, the students that we're talking about are just such a small share of the population. And then one last question about this part of the analysis, and then I'll continue on to the other slides and cover the other questions later. The measure of poverty that we're using in the analysis is the census poverty, is from the Census Bureau. So it is an estimate for each district of the number of students that are in families that are below the poverty level. It's not, FRL eligibility or direct certification measures or anything like that. It's the actual poverty based on the actual federal poverty level. And just to sort of wrap up a point that I've made sort of as I've been going through the slides throughout, 2 things here. One is that the gaps in state and local revenue between districts with the most and fewest students of color, or the most and fewest student English learners, those gaps were quite a bit larger than what we saw between districts with high and low percentages of students in poverty. The second thing to highlight here is that, it's not necessarily a given that, a state's funding formula, state policies, local allocation policies result in regressive or progressive revenue patterns across the 3 analyses that we looked at, right? Like California stands out in the set of maps on the slide here, where in the students of color analysis and the English learner analysis, like basically the districts are receiving about the same amount of revenue, but California's school funding policy is allocating, you know, like a significant amount more to its higher poverty districts than it is to its lowest poverty districts. So like the patterns that we see in one analysis are not necessarily, they differ and can vary across states. And the final finding that I'll cover here from our national and state level analysis is that, you know, state revenue is not allocated in a way that fully counteracts inequities in local funding. So this is sorry about that. Here are just a few examples where this is true, sort of the most egregious examples that we identified in the data, where, you know, like I'll pick on Connecticut specifically, but the pattern holds true for, you know, sort of all of these states on the slide. State leaders in Connecticut know that there are vast inequities in local revenue and the ability to raise local revenue between its highest and lowest poverty districts. That is why we see the state allocating so much more funding to its highest poverty districts, right? It's something like 3 to 4 times more that the state is sending to its highest poverty districts than it is to its lowest poverty districts. But because the lowest poverty districts in the state are able to raise so much more local revenue, we still see inequities in sort of total state and local funding in that state, right? The revenue raising capacity, the local revenue raising capacity of the highest poverty districts is just so much lower, that what the state is doing is not enough to make up for those gaps and for those differences. Okay. I will turn to the school by school spending data and sort of that analysis and what we found in it. So first, the key question that we were exploring in this particular analysis is, what are the overall patterns of funding equity between schools within districts, for students from low-income backgrounds, for English learners, for Black students, and for Latino students? This exploration used the, you know, sort of brand new school level spending data, school by school spending data that states are reporting to comply with the requirement in ESSA. It's worth noting that the requirement in ESSA just, you know, sort of asked states to put the data on their report cards. And then the Edunomics Lab went and pulled all that data or requested it from states when it wasn't available to compile it into a series of state-specific data sets. And we used those data sets that the Edunomics Lab compiled for this analysis from the 2019-20 school year. We used data from the National Center for Education Statistics and the Civil Rights Data Collection to pull out both information on student characteristics in schools and some other information about the opportunities that are available to students in schools, including students enrolled in, you know, sort of advanced coursework and the percentages of novice teachers. To get a sense of what the equity patterns are in spending across schools within districts, we conducted an analysis that is basically calculating the average amount of spending in a district for each group of students, right? So it's like the average amount of spending on Black students across schools in a district. And we compared those average spending numbers to the average spending number for a comparison group. And so in the analyses where we're looking at equity patterns in spending for students from low-income backgrounds, the comparison group was students who are not from low-income backgrounds. In the analysis for English learners, similarly, the comparison group is students who are not English learners. In the analysis for Black, Latino, and Native students, our comparison group is students who are not Black, Latino, or Native. And so it's not, it's not all students, it's not white students, it's like sort of the combination of students who are not in that group. So first, what did we find? First, it's worth noting that there are about 2,900 districts in the country that are actually large enough where this kind of analysis was actually meaningful. So that's the sort of the findings that I will talk about. The next finding that I'll talk about is restricted to those 2,900 districts, but the data tool includes all of the districts and schools in the country. Those 2,900 districts represent about 2/3 of all students in the country. And compared to the country as a whole, the districts have just a little bit more English learners, Black, Latino, and Native students, but about the same percentage of students from low-income backgrounds. And so in that analysis, we found that 97% of districts are not sort of spending more state and local funding for each of the student groups that we examined, right? So, and more here means at least 10% more, to the point that I made earlier about, sort of funding needing to be differentiated in some way, right? So that's like just about every single district in the country, in the analysis. State and local spending was flat or regressive, right? It's not progressive. We also found that, there are very few students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, and English learners who attend schools in a district that actually are spending more to meet their needs. So just 12% of Black students attend schools in districts where school funding for those groups is progressive, right? Meaning that spending is at least 10% more. And actually fewer than 5% of Latino students, students from low-income backgrounds and Native students attend schools in districts where school funding is, sort of progressively allocated to meet their needs. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick walkthrough of the data tool. So I will switch the screen that I am sharing. I'll share a different screen. Okay, so this is our data tool. It's at stateofeducationfunding.org. You can all, can I put this in the chat for folks? And when you land on the landing page, you'll first see, sort of a map of all states across the country, plus with different tabs for the students of color analysis, the students in poverty analysis, and the English learners analysis. And this sort of landing page here covers the national overarching findings that I shared through the slides a few slides back. You can click into any state. Well, you can hover over any state and sort of, and see what the analysis shows for that particular student group for that state. If you change to the students in poverty tab, for example, you'll see what the rating is for students in poverty. And similarly, if you change to the English learners tab, right? So it'll show you what the rating is overall across the country and for each state if you hover over in each of the different tabs. You can click into any state, and then it'll show you data for that state. And I loaded a few pages just to make sure I didn't run into any snafus. So here's California. The state level page in the tool goes through the state specific findings that I covered in the previous slides, right? So the difference in funding between the highest and lowest poverty districts in California is 12%. The highest poverty districts are actually receiving 12% more state and local funding. It does the same thing for the students of color analysis that I talked about. And then again, for the English learners analysis. Then it sort of presents the data all over again, but looks specifically and provides additional detail about the breakdown between state revenue sources and local revenue sources. Right, and so what this tells us is that the highest poverty districts in California are receiving 126% more state and local, state revenue only per student than the lowest poverty districts. Does the same thing for the students of color analysis. And then again for the English learners analysis. Then further down on the state pages, there's a series of charts that allows you to see where each state stands in comparison to all of the other states that were included in the analysis. So, you know, the data for California shows us that the highest poverty districts are receiving about 12% more state and local funding. And, you know, that is in the top third, top fifth of all states in the country. We see a similar pattern in the students of color analysis. And for the English learners analysis as well. So this is all about state gaps in state and local revenues per student. And then there's another series of charts that covers the same thing, just looking at state revenue. So you can sort of understand how the state revenue allocation only in each state compares to other states across the country. So poverty analysis is up here in red, and then we switch to the analysis based on the percentage of students of color, and then to the analysis based on the percentage of English learners in the state. Then there's a little bit of demographic information about students in the state who attends the schools. And that's it. And you go back up to the top of the page, and you can select a district from this dropdown. And you can, you know, so it's worth flagging two things here. One is just another, that the analysis that we're about to shift into is based on a different data source, right? The data on the state page and the national page is based on the federal revenue sources that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. And the data on the district and school page is based on the school by school spending data that states just started reporting to comply with the ESSER requirement. What that means is that one, we're looking at 1 year of data, not 3. And 2, now we can see data for all of the schools and districts in the country, regardless of charter status. And actually, before I select a district, I should flag that like there's a little bit of a note about the data that we're using here at the top of the state page. This talks about the federal sort of district level data sources. And then when I click into a district, this note here changes, and it is about the school by school spending sources that we used. So on the, I chose just to look at San Diego Unified District, just because I was there last week. And the tool will tell you sort of overall on average what the Average spending is across schools from federal funds and from state and local sources. And it's worth flagging here that, right, one, we were not looking at federal sources of data at all in the analysis, in the prior analysis. Two, here we are looking at state and local sources of revenue combined, and we cannot separate them out because for the most part, the data are not reported that way. When we're looking at the school by school spending data, they're generally reported together, the state and local sources. So this is the total amount per student, and then here's just a chart that's a visual display of that same information. Next, there's a section that sort of answers that primary sort of analysis question that I mentioned earlier, which is about the patterns in funding equity between schools and districts. And so what you see in this section is a scatter plot. This is all of the districts in the state. And it tells us that based on when we're looking at just state and local revenue, state and local spending for Black students specifically across all schools in the district, the funding pattern is basically flat. It's about $12,015 per student. The current district that you're looking at, the specific district page that you're on, is highlighted in this chart with the yellow dot. And then all of the other districts are highlighted with sort of their equity rating based on our analysis. And the selections that have been chosen up here. So if instead you wanted to look at patterns in federal spending for students from low-income backgrounds, and you only wanted to look at elementary schools, you can change all of those selections here, and all of the data that's down here will change. So again, we're looking at all of the districts in the state. The current district is highlighted with a yellow dot. And this tells us that federal spending per student on average for students from low-income backgrounds is progressive in San Diego. Here too, there's a little bit of information about the sort of demographic characteristics of students in the district. And then you can scroll back up and select a school from this dropdown. And I pre-selected Balboa Elementary. And so the first thing to flag here, right, is that you can open up this read more about the data tab, and it tells you a little bit more about the school by school spending data that's used in this analysis. We've got a little bit of information about the school itself, the type of school, whether it's a charter school, the urbanicity sort of locale, whether it's a city, suburb, town, or in a rural area, the grade span of the school, and then the total enrollment. This tells us, again, what total spending per student is in that school. This is from all sources, state, local, and federal sources. And then we have the breakout from state and local sources here and from federal funds here. This view also includes a little comparison to the district-wide average, just to give you a little bit more contextual information to understand sort of whether pattern, spending is lower or higher, and a couple of other distinctions that I'll talk about a little bit later. So this is the chart for the school, and then this is the chart, the breakdown for the district that I showed earlier on the district page. Here too, we've got a scatter plot that shows just the average spending on the y-axis and the percentage of students in a particular student group on the x-axis. So there's no equity analysis here because we're looking at individual schools. But the thing that you can do is try to see whether there are noticeable differences in spending again, federal or state and local or total by student group. And you can filter based on the school grade span. So you can take a look at the scatter plot here and like sort of visually see if there are patterns in spending across schools in the district with different characteristics. So these dots are schools in San Diego Unified. And then there's some additional information from the Civil Rights Data Collection on other resources that are available in the school. So here we're looking at opportunities in advanced coursework. Because this is an elementary school, we're using data from the CRDC, right? So we're using what is available. The measure that we're using is enrollment in gifted and talented programs. So what this chart is showing you is the distribution of student enrollment by race ethnicity overall in this school compared to the distribution of enrollment in gifted and talented programs by race ethnicity, right? So we see that Latino students make up 95% of students enrolled in gifted and talented programs and 86% of students in the school, for example. If this school had students enrolled in Algebra 1 in 8th grade, there'd be a similar chart here, or if they had students enrolled in advanced placement courses, there'd be a similar chart here. There's also some information about the percentage of novice teachers in the school compared to the district as a whole, right? And, you know, we thought it was important to include this information because it's like, it's hard to sort of know what to do about differences in spending numbers. Like the dollar amount, the amount of money that gets spent in a school isn't the only piece of this, of the, you know, sort of resource equity story in a school. And we thought it would be helpful to provide some additional information about the resources available to contextualize that the spending numbers a little bit more. And then again, there's a little bit more information about the demographic characteristics of students in the school and how that compares to the district as a whole. And so that information is both here in these charts, and there's sort of like just a written out quick explainer of what we see, right? So the share of students of color in the school is higher than the share of students of color in the district as a whole. The school has more students from low-income backgrounds, more English learners, and a percentage of students with disabilities that is about the same as the district. That's it. That is the tool. So I am leaving a little bit of time here for folks to explore it. I'm assuming you've been doing that on your own since I gave you the web address, but take just a little bit more time to explore the tool, to poke around. If you'd like, you know, you can try to answer the questions that are on the slide here for a particular state that you're interested in, or for a school district that you're interested in. I'm going to take a minute to answer some questions in the chat. Please send any other questions that you've got in the chat or the Q&A, and I will return to presenting in a few minutes. All right, first thing I'm going to address is free sharing a link to the tool. I hope everyone got that. I will put it in the chat again. Oh, sorry, the slide's not up. That's right. Slide's not up. Is the slide up now? Yes. Okay. Okay, let's see. So first question that I see is one about insight on how the new formulas for state and local funding would impact subgroups and districts that serve them. I mean, you know, like the new funding formula in Tennessee, I think, is absolutely a step in the right direction in terms of improving the equity and allocation across districts in the state. But, you know, I think a lot remains to be seen about how that plays out on the ground. And, you know, I look forward to analyzing data from Tennessee in a, you know, sort of honestly a few years from now, to see what kinds of changes the state is experiencing over time. The next question is, were there any major shifts in state allocation patterns? Any states that used to be regressive that are spending more progressively or vice versa? So that is one thing that we actually didn't focus on a whole lot. Two reasons. One is that the methodology that we're using this time around is slightly different than the methodology we used the last time we did this analysis. And so we can't make those kinds of apples to apples comparisons. Two is, I think I view these data as a starting point to understand, start to figure out where to start digging deeper to understand what's going on in a particular state. And I think those kinds of comparisons are best left to the state-based folks who have that additional contextual information to understand any sort of patterns or differences, or sort of bring additional color to differences that we might see. And so it is like those kinds of comparisons we just decided not to do for this analysis. There is a question that asks how we broke down the differences in spending on students by race within a district. So basically what we're doing is a weighted average of spending across schools in a district and sort of weighting that by the percentages of each group of students. Honestly, it is not a thing that I have learned to explain in a way that is like concise and clear. But you should take a look at the companion paper that we released with the school level spending data. It is called A Peek Inside the Black Box. I will put 2 links in the chat right now. One is for the whole sort of set of materials that we released along with this report. And then specifically, this like sort of access granted peek inside the black box quick brief that explains the methodology in more detail. This is a brand new tool. We have included a online data tool in our previous funding gaps reports, but this one is expanded. It's sort of more. There's more data. There's a lot more data in it because we are including the school by school spending data for the first time. In the tool, every state should have data for extra resources. It could be that the particular school that you're looking at just didn't have data for that, didn't have data in the civil rights data collection for that particular resource. Either that or, sort of there's a lot of pulling together of different data sets, and it could be that we just weren't able to like match every single school, but like generally, the school spending data that we're talking about here and the data from the civil rights data collection should include all schools in the country. If it's not there, it's like sort of just a one-off anomaly. Let's see. I think I've got time for like maybe 2 more questions before I want to bring folks back. In terms of data on additional resources, I don't know. I don't know if there are any states or districts that report data on teacher vacancies. I know that there are no federal data sources for that. And so the extent to which that's reported on a state-by-state basis would just depend on the state. We can, yeah, it would just depend on that particular state. For now, the data that's in the tool is static. We will make plans to update the tool if folks like you find it useful and are using it. So, use it, tell your colleagues, tell your friends. If there is demand for an update in the future, then we will certainly consider that very seriously. Okay, I'll take one last question because I think it is a helpful thing to point out in this data. So 2 things. The question notes that the tool has different amounts per pupil spending than the district website. That could be because of a couple of different things. One is that, the data in this tool is from the 2019 school year. And, the data that might be available on the district website could be from a different year. 2 is that for the most part, districts are reporting data to states, and then states are reporting the data back out. There could be instances where districts have on their websites data that is based on budget numbers, not actual spending numbers, data that is based on slightly different rules than the state used to calculate and report the data that it has put out. And then, the other thing is that it is this is a new data collection. It's new data reporting. And always when there is new data reported, there are issues, and folks, folks like you work with the data and notice discrepancies, and then, we go back, you have this back and forth process, this feedback loop to improve the calculation and reporting procedures for the next time around, right? I think, in our work with data, one of the most important things to do is to get data out there so that folks can use it and ask questions about it. And all that does is helps us improve both the data reporting and the the opportunities that are available to meet the needs of students. Okay, here's an explore the tool slide. So sorry, I realized I missed one of the questions that I wanted to answer. The other thing that it's worth pointing out is that if data for an entire school district is not included here, it's likely because of a reporting issue with the state, right? And so again, I think it really is important to have these kinds of tools out there so that folks are asking these kinds of questions and can push, district leaders, state leaders in their areas to, frankly, do a better job with the data reporting. All right. Any other questions from folks? Marissa, Nicholas, are there any questions that I missed that you think I should answer live here? Okay, then. That's what I've got, folks. I'm gonna turn it back over to Allison to close us out. Is that right?
That's right, Ivy. Thank you so much. I've had the luxury of getting to see Ivy present this many times. And every time I see her do it, I learn something new and I feel the urgency all over again. Like, these inequities are deep and persistent, and in our work to address them, the data is the first step. So thank you so much, Ivy. I have two jobs. One is to ask you to please complete this short feedback survey. I know it's tempting to sign off right now, but please click it. It's very short and it's incredibly helpful for us as we think about how to make our work useful to you all. And also to remind you that we have two other upcoming sessions in this series on data for equity that you can register for. On Wednesday, February 8th at 3 p.m., we've invited our friends at the National Council on Teacher Quality to share some data on inequitable patterns of teacher distribution and their implications for students. And then on February 15th, which is also a Wednesday at 3 p.m., we will have a panel of advocates from around the country talking about how they have leveraged data for their advocacy efforts and the lessons that they've learned. We're really excited about both of those and hope that you can join us. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.